Hello and welcome to the Temple Mount podcast. I am Shogun. Joining me today once again is my good friend Hermes, and we will be discussing, what will we be discussing? We will be discussing the character from competence and the path of power. You can read a description there. I'm going to let Hermes introduce it. But before we get started, just make sure you've joined the Temple Mount Discord server. At the top of the Temple Mount Discord server, you can find our hundreds of great Roundtable special events in the Roundtable podcast channel and our ongoing brand new and improved podcast, the Temple Mount podcast. You see that link there as well. Like, follow, subscribe, check out all those episodes. That being said, welcome, Hermes. How are you, my friend?
I'm good, and thank you for having me here. And as for the explanation of this, basically it's looking at morality. And I remember I had a podcast on this issue back with sin and weakness, and me trying to connect morality and power, or lack of power, and how there's a relationship between those two. I'm going to be explaining that.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I think rather than an interview, this is a little bit more of a presentation format, I believe. So where would you like to begin?
Well, I would like to give like an introduction here and there, and then anytime you feel like asking a question, pushing back, or do anything, by all means do so. Um, but like just give me like 2-3 minutes to get points across, and then. But yeah, it's kind of a interview, but at the same time a presentation. Um, so the argument that I'm making here is that character actually is a form of competence. Having good character is being competent. Knowing what to value is, in essence, a form of power. Um, because what is valuing, really? It is basically giving greater priority to one thing over another. It's a tool of selection that allows us to more effectively move towards our goals. And the more effective we are at discerning between what is valuable and what is not valuable, the more effective we're going to be able to move towards our goal. And as such, it is actually a form of power to know what to do and what not to do. So, and of course, I'm sure, many people have heard, knowledge is power. This is a form of knowledge. It's a knowledge of value. That's all it is. And really, why do we value things? I mean, first, before I answer why do we value things, how do we know the value of things? And there are different, metrics by which value can be assessed. And I will get into why the power metric, with respect to continuity, of course, is the most appropriate metric. But before that, the way we value things as a default is through our emotions and instincts. That is the baseline default. Over time, through interaction with society, culture, and the environment, our feelings about what is right or wrong may also change. So it's not, this inherent essentialist thing. However, it is important to look at the baseline and see why is it that we value the things we do. And of course, you know, after interacting with the environments, this gets into the nature and nurture question. And that's very difficult to pinpoint causal factors because it's very difficult to isolate variables and it's very difficult to have a control. When we know there's two factors that determine the outcome, and we don't know the extent by which they play a part in it, it kind of becomes hard to separate the two. But there are ways to go around this. We can look at patterns that span across different cultures, universal kind of values that do kind of exist. For example, I think it's kind of safe to say most people in this world value breathable air, or oxygen. Most people, I guess, say value clean water, and I'm assuming most people value sex or sexuality in some way, shape, or form. And of course, all of these actions are things that enable our continuity, our reproductive success, and our ability as a species or as life itself to continue perpetuating itself. And basically, where I'm going with this is that our values are determined by the success by which we move towards that goal. And is there anything you want to push back on or ask?
No, not really at this point. If you want to just maybe continue with your
Okay.
na-
So why do we value things? And I think this question is probably the most important one with respect to elucidating the concept of value. Value is determined by having a goal or standards or a dream or some base desire. In other words, there is, at least as far as I know, usually one fundamental axiom by which other values are determined. By looking at all of life, it appears that the general pattern is survival and continuity. And in fact, I would say continuity over survival because survival is just a tool to ensure the continuity. The moment you do have offsprings or whatever, the necessity for your survival goes down significantly. In fact, there are the cicada, that their entire they have that mating thing where they basically have sex and then they die, and then the next generation does it over and over and over again. And of course, for parents, humans, we have kids, and then we die, we give them our resources, we give them everything. We pass away, they continue. So it's not as much a selfish thing as much as it is a continuity thing. And I think it is very important to distinguish between those because one is very long term and has much bigger, grander destinies than just individual survival, which leads to, and even if you go full Machiavellian and crazy and act in a way that is for your interest at the expense of others, even if you do that, you're just going to get probably a couple extra years, and you're going to take so much more from the rest of the world. An asymmetry will be definitely created between how much you gain and how much is taken away. So it's not a very effective way to look at it from that angle. It's much more effective when we look at continuity and especially long term continuity. So one of the coolest thought experiments was, if we realize that, well, I'm gonna before I talk about the thought experiment, I'm gonna talk about the history of life on this planet a little bit. So the Earth is somewhat, hospitable, but it is still somewhat hostile as well. And by somewhat, I mean quite hostile, actually. 99% of all species that has ever existed on this planet has been extinct. Um, there are extinction level events that happen regularly at intervals, from magnetic pole shifts to asteroids to release of greenhouse gases due to the Milankovitch cycle and other cycles, which lead to positive feedback cycles and blah, blah, blah. All of these things play a huge part in the survival of life on Earth. And it is quite obvious that most life has failed, actually. And if we were to continue down, the primitive life forms path, all life would fail. In fact, it is only the intelligent life forms, humans specifically in this case, who knows what else might come, that are capable of life beyond Earth, that are capable of moving beyond the existential crises that we face. Societies that have the capacity to utilize science and utilize their environments using their brains, and intelligently assess how to deal with those threats are going to be the most capable of dealing with those threats. We could have planetary defense system, for example, that would fire against asteroids or any other type of existential crisis. That would not be possible for non-intelligent life forms. So, with respect to continuity of life, we can easily see why humans take the crown and are most valuable with respect to all life forms. We are the most successful expression of life. We are the most competent expression of life, and we're the only expression of life capable of going beyond the expiration date of Earth. Literally the only ones. And that does make humans very special and very valuable, at least for now, until something better comes along. And so also this means that there's a great responsibility on our shoulders. If it turns out there's going to be another existential, level crisis or ELE, existential level event, and if we're not prepared to deal with it, we're going to be perhaps squandering the chance of life continuing from this planet forever. So it's a huge responsibility. And where else should I go with this? Yeah, I'm just going to stop here and ask if there's anything you want to clarify or ask.
Well, I guess if I was to try and just repeat back to you what I think you're saying that power is the most important thing to pursue because power is what allows us to achieve our goals, and the most important goal is continuity. So, in order to ensure continuity, we must pursue the path of power. Is that the basic concept?
Yes, actually, that is a very appropriate summary. And of course, power, there are many ways of looking at it, but the most simple one is the ability to achieve one's desires. I mean, it's basically the simplest one. But we can look at it from, different metrics. So quality of life, degree of scientific achievement, infrastructure, functionalist perspective from sociology, the problem-solving ability of, cultures, nations, and people with respect to challenges and obstacles. This is like how I would objectively assess power. This is another thing that defeats the whole cultural relativist angle, where it's like, oh, that's just your culture, bro. That's cool, Oh, but in my culture, that's totally not cool. But you do you, I do me. That attitude of cultural relativism is obfuscating the reality that there are different levels of success by virtue of different means or different expressions of culture or society. And knowing those that are more effective, we can then determine which ones are objectively worse, and of course which ones literally lower the chances of life continuing, and why we should move away from certain types of culture or lifestyles, and why we should
I
move towards other
I
ones.
I have a question for the brother,
Sure.
but I'll wait. I'll wait.
I,
Yeah, you were muted because of exactly that reason, Mason. So, um, unfortunate. Carry on, Hermes.
and I want to now go back a little bit on continuity and why continuity is the most effective fundamental axiom, and why it must take precedence over other axiomatic values. So the interesting and unique thing about the axiomatic value of continuity is that without continuity, values cannot even exist. If we do not and even if we do not fully understand, our purpose or whatever in life, without continuity, we'll never figure that out. So continuity is basically the bedrock by which everything else is placed upon. Continuity is a prerequisite for everything else. Then it is by virtue a necessity. Then it is by virtue of necessity the most valuable thing. Because it is necessary for everything else, it becomes automatically the most valuable thing. And then if we know what the most valuable axiomatic value is, then we can build on it which one leads more effectively to it. And this creates a very objective lens by which what is better and what is worse. And I think really value theory, ethics are subjects that are not talked about enough, I would say, in the public sphere, especially when a lot of people get into politics and other sorts of shit. Without these like meta ethics and why is something valuable, without value theory, you're kind of lost. So it's really important to approach it from the angle of meta ethics, and whatever path you take, but as long as it's systematic and consistent. Um, so let me. There was a couple other things I wanted to get into. Oh yeah, evolutionary psychology, and then I was going to talk about rational self-interest. But let's just go on evolutionary psychology a little bit. And basically, evolutionary psychology focuses on selection theories and how that plays a part in our value system, and why we value things and how we behave, and our psychology. And one way to look at it is if we have a group of individuals with different values or different capacities of, moving towards things. Yeah, different value systems. That's all I need to say. And then if we just let them, loose, and some of them survive better than others, and then they reproduce and have offsprings, and let's say some of those instincts are passed down over a period of time, there's going to be a selection towards values that are more successful than those that are not. And there are two specific theories that go towards this. One is error management theory, and the other one is sexual selection theory. Error management theory is just basically that there is an inherent bias, like the universe has a bias towards path of low risk and high reward, and there's a bias against the path of high risk, low reward. Basically, if you follow one of those paths, you're going to go extinct, and the other one is going to make it more likely for it to continue. There's, of course, a sexual selection theory, which is about, it's about the traits and values that favor reproductive success. And the funny thing is, some of these traits can be actually detrimental to the survival of the individual or whatever. So like peacocks can have like really colorful shit that makes them very easy targets, but the benefits they get from the sexual selection, it surpasses the predatory weakness that they get from it, the weakness of being spotted by predators. So it's quite interesting. It's about how much copies you make and how and of course, the universe itself is what acts as a selecting mechanism. It acts as a sieve, basically, between what works and what doesn't work, what continues and what does not continue. And I think this division kind of separates really error from truth. And I think that's quite amazing, actually. But I would also like to talk about that. Yeah, I was going to mention that even though there's like a kind of a cold mechanical method by which values, empathy, virtues, and all these things come from, this goal of continuity, this doesn't actually make it less valuable, or it doesn't make it less meaningful. If anything, I would say it makes it more meaningful and more valuable. If, functionality and empathy, altruism, cooperation, align, that just means that it is almost, in essence, universally valuable. Those things that I mentioned right now, because those things lead to functionality and, more effective continuity. So it's amazing how morality and efficiency actually go hand in hand. And that makes sense because morality is a value system, and a value system is supposed to guide you in life. So, the more effective your value system, more effectively you're going to go towards your path. It seems kind of obvious. And I'm glad that cooperation, altruism, compassion, empathy are the ones that are more effective. And we can also see this on the micro scale, single cell life forms versus multi-cell life forms, and how they work, how the cells cooperate, how there isn't any internal war in the human body, really. I mean, if there is, you have autoimmune disorder and it sucks. But generally speaking, that's not the case. You could also have cancer, which is like a group that kind of disconnects from the harmony of the rest of the system and grows rapidly and sucks resources as much as possible until the host dies, and therefore it dies. Therefore, it's not a smart method, but still it does it. And so like the macro, micro, as above, so below can also be seen with respect to like single cell life form or viruses or, all sorts of shit. And I just think we have enough clues to figure out why we value the things we do, I think. Is there anything you want to add?
Well, do you think it might be a good time to open it up for questions now?
Yeah, but before I do so, there's one last thing I wanted to get into, which was the rational self-interest one, and why, like, how that relates to cooperation, compromise, and relates to the path of power. So basically, as an individual, in many cases, it is more beneficial for you to be part of a group, organization, state, government, something. There is a mutual benefit with respect to that. And by working with others, you do require to have some compromises. But even with those compromises, you're still better off than you would be otherwise. So those compromises are in your interest, actually, because they allow the cooperation, which then allows a greater chance of continuity in life. And so this actually explains a lot of behavior, even from exploitation as well. we can see that if someone joins an organization that's exploiting them, you're still doing it because it's better than the alternative. This doesn't mean that it's good. You should always look at it from the perspective of how effective or how efficient the system could be. And my argument is systems that exploit, even though it does lead to a better outcome. Like if it's a choice between like starving and dying or, working as a slave, working as a slave will get you, going. I'm talking about an actual slave, by the way. It's not even a, for wage or anything. Then you still choose that because it is in your rational self-interest to continue, in spite of the horrors that you face. But then you can still analyze this with respect to power or continuity or efficiency and see that exploitation or this type of conflictual agreement, I guess. I wouldn't even say agreement. Conflictual cooperation, but that seems like an oxymoron. Conflictual system actually is less efficient because there's conflict. There's going to be fighting. The moment that there is a conflict of interest, your actions will be basically doing the minimum you can to get what you want. And the moment you get a chance to stab back or strike back, you will, because there is no loyalty, there's no nothing behind it. And cooperation actually fosters a more effective organization. One that doesn't exploit allows the units of that system to maximize their potential, thus leading to a more effective system that is more capable and more powerful, and more effective at dealing with problems. So, even though like being part of an organization is better than not being part of an organization can be much better than it is currently, and we can objectively assess that as well. So there is that. And I think I've gone over most of the. Yeah, I think I'm kind of done. Sure, let's go to questions.
All right. So I know Misum had a question he's been waiting to ask. So go ahead, Misum. Misum, going once. All right. Well, if not, is there cases, I guess I could just ask, where power, or the pursuit of power might actually lead to a decrease in the chance of continuity? Or in other words, how do we account for the fact that if the wrong people get power or have the wrong aims or goals, then their path to power might actually end continuity, right? So if people have the goal for whatever reason to destroy the world, then they get more power, they can achieve their goal, but that won't help continuity. So isn't there something of a paradox there where the same power that can ensure continuity will also be its biggest challenge or threat?
I mean, it's not as much as power, but the path to power that is important. So, like, if we're to analyze and say there's, a group using their power in a destructive way, then, and if it leads to discontinuity, then by definition it leads to disempowerment. Because if there's no continuity, all power, everything just goes to shit. So it's more about a lens of analysis, kind of like the functionalist lens of analysis. And so it's more about what path maximizes potential, what path leads to the most ability, what path creates the more competent society capable of overcoming obstacles and threats and challenges and existential level crises or whatever. And that, I think, can clarify between misuse of power or a ineffective path of power.
I see. And what about, is there any problem with making continuity the prime value? So, for example, if we had the ability to keep humans at like a Stone Age level or like a medieval level, right? Say that for some reason we knew that if everybody just stayed like serfs, like feudal peasants, all they did was like farm potatoes and that was it. But we could guarantee that that would go on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. It would never end, right? I know that's not the actual case because you said, asteroids and so forth, but for some reason, just a very basic, unenriched life was the most continuous. Would it be best to pursue that because that guarantees continuity? Or could we say that, we should try to evolve new technology and this and that, even if that includes a greater risk of discontinuity, right? So we try and make like fusion reactors, but there's a chance they're going to melt down and like burn the whole planet. Like, in other words, don't we have to weigh in things like progress, growth, even things like happiness, pleasure, learning, like other things, right? In other words, is continuity enough of a prime value, and aren't there things that might even be worth risking continuity? Or is continuity always unriskable?
I would say that continuity is the prime value because without it, there is no value. But the the beautiful thing about continuity is that it does lead. Not only does it lead, it necessitates thriving. It necessitates improvement continuously. And there are a couple of reasons I can point out towards that fact. One, even if we're living in a very stable Earth, let's say it has a quadrillion, years of continuity. There's no stability, and people can live on it, for quadrillions of years without anything happening. The thing is, there's always unknown unknowns, and the fact that there is always unknown unknowns, and the fact that unknowns could potentially be a threat, it literally necessitates the pursuit of knowledge. This is why I believe that if an AI actually takes over and if it is programmed correctly with philosophy and the need of continuity, I truly, truly, absolutely believe that that would be a philosopher king AI that learns about the universe, learns about values, learns about all sorts of crazy things. And I know I'm going into a kind of a weird sci-fi territory here, but where I'm going at with this is that there is a logic to our paths, to our lives. And one of those logics is that if you value continuity, then you must also value continuous self-improvement in an unknown world where there's unknown unknowns, and also in a world where there's threats and a changing universe. And even if we're to grant stability, we still have the unknown problem, which then requires us to move towards a society that leads us more effectively towards knowledge. And that would then, lead to other values like cooperation, this, that, whatever.
Thank you. Did anyone else have a question for Hermes?
I didn't have a question, but I had something to add. So whenever I could say that.
And please add.
It's very safe to say that the Roman Empire has been our most successful, the most successful empire, the most successful nation on earth because of its longest continuity. And one of its main aspects, one of the main things that has made it last so long is because they did not seek total obliteration of their enemies. They did destroy their enemies when necessary, but they tried to make their enemies their friends, or at least if that's not possible, they tried to use whatever the other cultures had around them to their advantage. For example, if another culture had better weapons, better tactics, or whatever, they would incorporate that into their own culture, and that has made them survive for so long. It's the main characteristic of this incredibly successful and to this day reverence society that influenced the whole world, no matter where you live.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think there are other also great empires of the past that had very successful systems of governance. And indeed, being overly hostile, aggressive, is not at all effective. And I want to add something else to it that I forgot to add to the whole thing was suffering. A lot of times in philosophy or philosophy class, especially if you're like utilitarian or whatever, minimizing suffering and maximizing happiness are usually the most common utilitarian arguments. And the reason I stray from that is there's some really huge problems that come from it. Well, not necessarily because I can get into that. But before I do, I just want to make it clear that power actually does, or at least the path of power, leads to a minimization of suffering. And the, so a couple of reasons for that. One, if you have power, if your potential is actualized, right, whatever potential you have, the more powerful you become as an individual, the more you can get closer to your dreams. And the difference between dreams and reality is, I would say, the roots of suffering, which is also what Buddha says, desire is the root of suffering. And the reason desire is the root of suffering is because there's a difference between reality and, your desire, your dreams. And I would say there are different levels of that. There is the distance, that's a metric. But then there is the rate of moving towards or moving away from it. And then there's also the acceleration with respect to the rate of movement. All of those are factors. Are you moving towards your dream? How far are you from your dream? Are you accelerating in your direction towards your dream? All of those things, I believe, lead to either joy or suffering. And power is the one that really gets you closer to your dream. At the end of the day, people that say you don't need money or you don't need to succeed or whatever to be happy, they don't have your best interest in mind. Continuously improve yourself, continuously empower yourself, and make yourself as competent as possible. That is really what is in your best interest. Think, use your mind. Think and be rational. And that's it. I don't know what else to say.
Does anyone else have a question for Hermes? So you sort of started to answer it there, but if someone heard this and said, "Yeah, I agree, I need to start this path to power," what would you say is sort of the best first step that someone could go on?
I think there are. That's a difficult one. First step. I would say the first step is self-improvement, really, above everything else. So I would say, improve your ability to rationalize. That's going to improve your ability to discern, cost-benefit analysis, all that shit. So I would say study logic, philosophy. That's where I would start with usually. And then from that, you can then build on, But yeah, that's where I would start.
With the study of philosophy.
Yes.
That's a pretty big field. Can you give someone a tip on where they should start with philosophy?
Sure. I mean, you can go for like a general course, but which is very useful to get like an idea. But and that also it's really useful to look at the branches and where it goes. So an overview is, I would say, essential. Actually, get the overview. But then, by chance, I took logic, and I think maybe this is bias, but I think that is the next class that I would recommend because logic is required to navigate all fields of philosophy. Every argumentation, every metrics by which we analyze value, so value theory, epistemology, systematic method, or sorry, the pursuit of knowledge, which systematic methods of pursuing knowledge, like science, or we can have, I don't know, other forms like a priori, whatever, which just means from the former, and that's also systematic. But anyways, the point is, without logic, you can't navigate those fields effectively. So I would say the most fundamental foundation for navigating philosophy is to have a very strong understanding of logic. And I mean like super strong understanding of fundamental logic. Kind of like if you want to know anything about math, you really need to know your basic arithmetics. Like that's really essential. The same way I would say for thinking and philosophy. The basics of logic absolutely are essential. And then you can go wherever you need to go. Wait, I would say critical theory, not critical theory, sorry, critical thinking is the next one I would go. So general philosophy, logic, and then critical thinking. That's the three I would recommend.
Are there any sort of protections or guidelines that we could put in place to ensure that when people begin this path of power, it leads them in a moral as opposed to an amoral direction? Because I'm sure you would agree, it's possible to be powerful and evil. And although I would agree with you that if you're powerful and evil, that's generally going to end up backfiring because evil will generally destroy the conditions of continuity and might ultimately lead you to lose the power you have. It's still true that very evil people can be very powerful, and that people who are obsessed with the pursuit of power are actually often more likely to be evil than people who aren't obsessed with the pursuit of power. So is there any way to sort of protect against the inherent amorality of power? Like, I agree with you that power is sort of on the moral side of the axis because all other things being equal, power is good, and without power you can't do anything, but power is still sort of amoral despite that. in that it can be turned to good or evil purposes. So I'm wondering, is there a way to kind of protect against the unethical acquisition or use of power?
I mean, I think the answer would be to literally the next step would be ethics, right? The value theory. I think it is actually really important for people to have a strong system of ethics. I mean, fully fleshed out all the way to the core. Explore why you value the things you do, and be consistent. And I would say actually one of the biggest issues really is a lack of like coherency. So
Mm.
there's a lot of cognitive dissonance all around. I have it. I'm not gonna say I don't. I have a lot of it still. And I would say that also can exist with your values. There can be conflictual values, and then based on whatever confirmation bias or whatever you have, you may at the moment side with one over the other, and these are pitfalls. So I would say have a strong ethics system, and also in order to compensate for the weaknesses of the human mind, perhaps learn about the human mind by taking a course also in psychology to learn why the brain acts the way it does. What are our biases? Why do we have biases? Well, I'll just give a short summary. It's because we need to make quick decisions really fast. We can't go through the calculations, so we make approximations based on patterns. So that may or may not be useful. Turns out in many cases, especially in modern society, it's not useful. It was, but anyways, the understanding of the brain's weaknesses or biases or all sorts of errors that we have can then make it less likely for us to fall for those pitfalls that you mentioned.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Mason.
All right. So I have to ask you, where exactly does your morality comes from?
Um, it fundamentally comes from after assessing and introspection. It's continuity of life or
Okay. So
continuity.
um, continuity of life is what?
It is valuing the idea that life continues to exist given the change of time.
And that makes you a better person?
Um, with respect to my ethical system, yes, I guess. I don't know. Well, I don't know. Do you have it in opposition to that? If not, then no. I don't know. It's a weird question. It's not about me, being better. It's about just what my value system is, period. And I've justified why I believe existence is more valuable. Sorry, continuity is more valuable because it's the fundamental bedrock. It's the
If I could
base.
translate, I think what he's saying, Misam, is not that he's better because of anything, but that if you're trying to decide what is moral, you must ask yourself what is most likely to preserve continuity. So if I do something and because I do that, me and my offspring are going to go extinct, then that would probably be an immoral thing to do. But if I do things that are responsible and save up food and money and raise my kids well so that their continuity will continue, that's probably an ethical thing to do. So if I could just try and translate, I think Hermes is saying the basis of ethics is making decisions that maximize continuity, and unethical decisions are those that undermine continuity. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Hermes, but that's how I
Yeah.
would.
No, but
Thanks.
thank you for explaining it. But at the same time, like it is a little bit of what I asked him was like him personally,
What about me personally?
you personally, what kind of morality do you have?
I
No, he answered that question already, Mason. So you've had about 4 chances to ask your question, and I think it's been answered about 5 times. So does anyone else have a question for Hermes?
I do have a question. It's a little complex. I'll have to explain, so I'll just go ahead. Imagine yourself in a situation. It's like in the Bronze Ages or something. There are two villages, and because agriculture fucking sucked back there, this probably happened. Well, no, actually, it did happen on a massive scale. In fact, there are massive crop failures affecting your people, and you haven't been able to produce food, and winter is coming. Your entire village, your family, your friends, they're all going to die. But there is a city not too far. You can reach it maybe by boat or maybe by traveling, and they have food. Their crops didn't fail. You could say that they are better for the continuity of life because they have been able to continue their society, and therefore they should have the right to survive over your city. But everyone's going to die if you don't try to make an agreement with them, which is very unlikely since they only stored enough food for their village to go over the winter. So basically, conflict is almost inevitable, and you have to attack that village, and there will be chaos, murder, people will die, and it could be the case of the obliteration of both villages, or their village, or your village. In any case, I think well, to me, logically, it would be better if their village survived because they will make better continuity. Because the next winter, probably their crops won't fail because maybe because they're better at agriculture or whatever. So, what's your position in that? Imagine if you're in the village where you're in charge of the village that where the crops fail. What decision would you take? Would you allow everyone to starve, or would you attack the other village or their resources?
I mean, this is a sad fact about reality that there is going to be conflicts of interest popping up here and there due to scarcity and many other things. Although I would say those are becoming less relevant as our ability to produce improves and our productivity increases. But back to the village example, if I was to be consistent with my values from a at least rational self-interest perspective, I would say that. Oh, hold on, damn. Because I can look at it from two angles. I can look at it from the rational self-interest angle, at the exclusion of the big picture, which would then necessitate war, even if there's a higher chance of losing. But if I were to be like super like big picture or whatever, at that point, if you are gonna die, and there's nothing you can do about it besides a war that you're maybe potentially gonna lose. I'm guessing because the other one is more competent, less starving, and blah blah blah. Then really, I mean, I don't think everyone is going to die in a situation like that. I think you can make choices where some people can survive and others don't. I think that's possible. And I know it sounds fucked up, but we even do that in hospitals today, where if there's like a limited amount of doctors and a lot of patients or organs or whatever, we have to choose. Scarcity just leads to that, unfortunately. But let's just say that it's crazy, crazy extreme and everyone is going to die unless you fight. I would say yeah, perhaps sometimes sacrifice or noble death in grace is better than a violent one in disgrace in that scenario. So maybe just write down everything you've done as a society, archive everything, all your knowledge, all your equipments, and leave it for whoever discovers it, and then peacefully, go away. If really the situation is that bad, rather than harming another group that is more successful and potentially dragging everyone else down with you.
Thank you for everyone's questions and
Makes it
participation. Go ahead.
simple.
You're lagging, I think. Never mind.
While we wait for Black Feathers, if he wants to come back, does anyone else have a question or a comment for Hermes?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dresh.
All right. I guess my question is, does the notion of stability in ideology or in and it having to be symbiotic with its host have any kind of factor in the sense that, if you're moral and I'm moral, and there's another person who's less moral, but they're, by your standards, but that their lack of morality actually conveys upon them some kind of advantage. I mean, the an emergent property from that will be over time in the aggregate they would outcompete the moral people potentially. Now, granted, there's stability, there's benefits from cooperation, but it's a back and forth environmental kind of thing. Are you if you, are you okay with the notion that what's moral might not necessarily be what's best or what wins, or are you stating that the morality in the long run will ultimately be what's best in the aggregate, if not even at an individual level?
Well, I mean, I don't know if you were here for like the first half, but I actually defined morality by the success or by what works, basically, what leads to continuity. So, by definition, morality would lead to the path of greater success.
Yeah, no, but I mean, what happened? Like, what I'm talking about is when the path to greater success is different from different categories. When we say something's good, we have to say who it's good for. Okay, so if, for example, there's the species splits and there's like two distinct groups that just can't reproduce with one another, and so on and so forth, and yada yada, or what might be best for one might not be best for the other, or different strategies which are potentially good in certain environments but aren't good in others. And so, how can you, in the same way that genes, while there's evolution that takes place over the aggregate, it always takes place at the individual level because only the individual can actually have the genes modified within them. In the same way, uh, how do you get to that greater good point when, after a certain amount of success, that will necessarily allow parasitic moralities, parasitic codes and strategies to emerge within that? Like, are you assuming that there's a meta ethic where it's a symbiotic kind of thing where you have to have a certain number of these kind of people and a certain number of these kind of people? Or are you saying that there will be one unified moral code shared between all groups of sentient beings? Do you get what I'm saying?
I think I do, and I just maybe I don't, but I'll try to explain my points across, and then maybe you can then respond and clarify for me. But like the rational self-interest and conflict of interest, those two happen. And I am not a person that shies away from the concept of war or in-group, out-group dynamics. In fact, I can go into that into great detail, and maybe I should do a whole podcast on it. But basically, when you're dealing with an outgroup due to a conflict of interest, the interactions by which you have with them is one of, subjugation, assimilation, or destruction, or whatever. Basically, you would take actions for your interests at their expense. Ideally, you would want to convert people to your side. Second, less ideal is a form of subjugation, and the most desperate of all is complete destruction, which is kind of what you do in war, because you don't have the privilege of assimilating or converting or anything of that nature. So, when it comes to a conflict of interest, really, in some senses, power does lead to the judge of who's going to be the victor. Really, power is the determining factor about who's going to win when there's a conflict of interest. And based on what I was arguing about, how like cooperation and blah 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 is more successful. Therefore, if there is a war from I don't know, let's say Nazis or whatever, those types of people, they're gonna. I would say it's in our best interest to blow them up, basically. And that's due to multiple reasons. Oh God, I think I went off on a tangent there when I brought the Nazis in. But I think
No,
those
it's
were a really
okay.
easy group to demonize. The point is, war is sometimes necessary and inevitable, and the ones that are more competent usually turn out to be the ones that are more moral. And thus, the cycle will correct itself.
I'm not. Uh, what I mean, that kind of answers the question, but it begs one more question. Sorry. Uh, it can be pretty clear the level at which you should have a symbiotic relationship, within the group or within people who pass whatever ethical or moral standard test to be allowed within the group, and so on and so forth. But the standards by which individuals or even categories of people might potentially are excluded from that group, and like what the line or lines are for saying you are part of the moral crowd and you are not part of the moral crowd. It's not an easy question, you know, and so I'm kind of and I'm not trying to say, I mean, limited time. It's not something I'm accusing you of skating over, but without knowing which, or without explicitly stating what the meta ethical standards or methodologies for inclusion or exclusion within the cooperative are, it becomes very difficult because it can just evolve to subjective tribalism and justify itself by we are the good people, therefore what we do is good. You get what I'm saying?
Right, and I did get into the meta ethics and how we determine what is ethical, and by that we can determine what the goal is. And the goal was maximizing continuity, and then from that we can, differentiate between what is in group or out group if they have the same primary goal. Basically, if there's a conflict of interest, there's automatically exclusion from a group. You can't have a conflict of interest and be part of that group, actually cooperating with that group. You could be part of a group in the form of subjugation or something else, but you're not actually part of that group. So the defining metric, or the defining factor, sorry, is the interests. If there is an alignment of interest, which we could say that for most rationally self-interested individuals with a brain, maximizing continuity and their successful, the chance of their offspring successfully reproducing on, living to further generations, and blah blah blah. And even if you don't, you could have kin genes being spread. So like even if you don't spread yourself, you could live in such a way or create a world by which the offsprings of your brothers and sisters get more successful, and thus your genes, in a sense, continuing forwards, and blah 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 blah. So really, it's that either you're going to be working towards continuity of life and be in the same group, or you're going to be against it, an enemy of life, and then you'll be fucked. That's it.
Well, one last one. Don't let me dominate if someone else says something. But there have been purity spirals based upon, for example, like a group of communist guerrilla fighters go off into the woods. Then they have an ideological disagreement, and then they fracture, and then some of them don't come back because they're not really part of the group, or they're long-term futurists who like we have to shed our mortal coil. But some of them want to do that by bringing about AI and replacing humans with robots, and the others want to create super mutants, and we can't work together. We have to fight, and if you go based upon long-term goals, which ideological principle-based morality will necessarily be concerned with the long-term utilitarian results of things, then the slightest disagreement can result in a huge amount of fracturing. Whereas individuals who don't give a damn about morality in any kind of way, they're largely just stimulus hedonist people, whatever, can fit comfortably as workers or what have you within any kind of society. And so, is there perhaps a concern that if if we are guided in large part by moral decisions, and we put that and thinking long and hard about the long-term ramifications of our ethics and use that as a standard by which we form tribes, that this will in effect cause undue fracturing in society because people will be largely concerned with achieving goals that really they have no power to achieve in their life and really has little bearing upon their life, and we've just created more tribes and more dysfunction, more disunity as a result of being concerned with things that we ultimately are beyond the scope of our own lives because we're not concerned with our individual actions and simple just go along to get along, but instead driven by ideological utopian visions.
So there really isn't any neglection of individuals or individuality in this, and I did talk about rational self-interest and why it makes sense to be part of a group and organization, and why compromise is essential and cooperation, blah blah blah. I did get into that, and I also talked about how multicellular life forms can form as a kind of a blueprint that we can look at. But just want to go back to the argument about different kind of visions for the future. That's fine as long as you have the same fundamental goal. So if people have a same fundamental goal but different means by which they want to achieve that, you can then objectively compare the two and literally cooperate towards the same objective by clashing those methods with each other and finding out which one is actually more effective with respect to that goal. So as long as the fundamental goal is the same, and this seems like a very fundamental goal that a lot of people can get behind, so to actually foster unity rather than division, then it would just be a matter of how effectively we would get closer to that. And again, with continuity, this is looking at life itself and the pattern it has. It is inherently built into us to want to continue with respect to our offsprings, with respect to ourselves, with respect to our dreams and visions, to our legacy. All of these things would necessitate continuity, which would then necessitate having that same goal. And that would actually, I believe, foster great unity across all sorts of diverse people. Oh, yeah. Also, the people that don't care. I mean, it doesn't matter if people care or not, as long as they, I mean, it's better if they care because they're going to act more effectively, more ethically, and blah, blah, blah. But if they don't, it's unfortunate, but I wouldn't want to hurt them or anything. Ideally, I would want them to become better people and self-actualize more, get more involved in the world. But, if that's not the case, then I guess the next best thing we can do is, utilize whatever menial existence they have, in a way that's beneficial for everyone.
Thank you for your questions, Druish, and your answers, Hermes. Last chance. Does anyone else have a question they didn't get a chance to ask? Hermes, this has been great content as always. Thank you for coming on the Temple Mount podcast. Please make sure you've listened to Hermes' numerous excellent podcasts on the Roundtable podcast series at the top of the channel. Hermes, do you have a closing thought or takeaway message for the people?
Yeah. Don't move away from power because it's been associated with corruption. It's, I think, one of the most horrible failures of our, culture and society, this demonization of power due to a fear of its misuse. I think that's missing the point, and can actually really lead to harm. Also, yeah, when it comes to like money, success, self-improvement, all that shit, seek it. Absolutely fucking seek it. Improve yourself, get as rich as you fucking can, and take care of yourself.
Thank you very much, Hermes. Thank you to our audience and our questioners and participators. Please make sure you've joined the Temple Mount Discord server where we record the Temple Mount podcast once every day. Tomorrow we will have Josh and the Shell talking about social engineering, and that will be very interesting, taking place at 8 p.m. Central tomorrow. Keep an eye on the announcements channel, like, follow, and subscribe to the Temple Mount podcast. And thank you very much, everybody. God bless. I will see you upstairs in the video chat or whatever room. And join us again next time. Thank you. Come again. Let's all jump up as the podcast is over. It's time to vacate this room. I will see you in the video chat channel.